He sat by the faded window of a weather-worn apartment, its paint curling like old skin beneath a relentless sun. The blinds were half broken, letting in thin strips of dusty light that cut across the silence, like forgotten memories. His name was Elijah Ward, a name once spoken with honor in military briefings and whispered with respect in conflict zones overseas. Now, it echoed only within the chipped walls of his one-bedroom unit, lost in the white noise of a world that had moved on. Elijah was a man carved out of the war, the kind of man who didn't flinch at gunfire but would pause for a falling leaf. His eyes, once scanning foreign deserts for hidden threats, now lingered on people passing by the sidewalk below, searching for a reason to still be seen. Decades ago, he led a special operations unit. He was the type who entered hell so others wouldn't have to. But medals tarnish in drawers, and stories lose their weight when there's no one left to listen. Time, unforgiving and invisible, had stripped him of more than youth. It had robbed him of relevance. His days were quiet, almost surgical in their simplicity. Coffee at 6. Newspaper, even though the headlines rarely changed. A long walk past the school, the pharmacy, and the park he used to patrol in his mind like a soldier still on duty. Sometimes the children waved. Most days no one noticed. His military pension covered just enough to survive, but never enough to matter. In this neighborhood, no one cared if you had once stared death in the eye. Rent was due either way. Elijah had grown used to invisibility, not the tactical kind he once mastered in the field, but the kind that stings. The kind where people speak around you in grocery lines as if you were part of the air. He never complained. He never needed to. He carried dignity like others carried keys, quietly, always in reach, never flaunted. He kept to himself. Not out of bitterness, but because his silence was a discipline forged in jungles, deserts, and war rooms. It wasn't that he didn't want to speak. He just didn't want to speak unless it mattered. And so, when people saw him, stoic, gray-bearded, with eyes that held both sorrow and storms, they often mistook his stillness for weakness. Or worse, for irrelevance. But Elijah Ward was not irrelevant. No, he was simply waiting. Waiting for the moment the world would remember what it had forgotten. Waiting not for recognition but for a reason. And that reason was about to arrive, hidden in the ordinary, wrapped in injustice, born from a simple, cruel mistake. It was on a Thursday, one of those still, amber-colored afternoons when even the wind seemed too tired to move, that Elijah first noticed him. Slouched on the far side of the corner across from the old pharmacy, barely visible between the shadows and discarded flyers, sat a figure that didn't quite belong, and yet somehow blended into the scenery like an old scar on a familiar street. He was wrapped in a coat far too large for his fragile frame, and his wheelchair, rusted, one wheel slightly bent, tilted just enough to make one shoulder lower than the other. His head was bowed, his hands resting motionless on his knees, and in front of him, a small cardboard sign lay on the pavement, handwritten in shaky ink. Just food. God bless. Elijah passed by without stopping the first time. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew what it felt like to be stared at without truly being seen. But something about the man, perhaps the quiet dignity with which he held his posture, or the way his eyes remained closed, not pleading but resting, caught Elijah's attention. The next day, he brought a sandwich. No words, just a silent gesture. He placed it gently in the man's lap and walked on, leaving the beggar with a slow nod, like a soldier saluting an equal. It continued, day after day. One sandwich. Sometimes a warm drink. Never conversation. Just presence. They never exchanged names, not at first. But over time, small details began to surface like sunken ships rising from memory. The beggar had a deep, gravelly laugh when pigeons fought over crumbs. He always said thank you, without looking up. He never asked for more. He never spoke of pity. To Elijah, that meant everything. Weeks passed. The city remained as indifferent as ever, and so did most people. But for Elijah, this silent ritual had become the heartbeat of his days. It reminded him of old missions, those quiet acts of watching someone's back, of showing up even when words failed. Eventually, one morning, as Elijah placed the usual paper bag into the man's lap, the old beggar finally looked up. His eyes were cloudy, but clear where it mattered. A glint of knowing, of gratitude, of recognition. "You the only man feeding me like I'm not broken," he said, voice cracked like old wood. "Most folks just drop a coin and run off like I'm contagious." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He simply sat down beside him on the curb, the two men in silence, while the world rushed past them like a blur of noise and judgment. The man smiled, slow and tooth-worn. "Name's Papa J. Least that's what they called me when I still had legs and music in my hands." That day, Elijah learned more than he expected. Papa J had once been a jazz musician, a damn fine one too, if you believe the fire in his voice when he spoke of brass and backrooms and bourbon-stained stages. A car crash had taken his legs, but the slow corrosion of the world's apathy had taken more. He wasn't just a beggar. He was a man who had been applauded once, admired, even loved. Now, he was an invisible fixture on a busy corner, where people passed by with earbuds and excuses. But not Elijah. Something unspoken passed between them that day, a tether, fragile but real, pulled tight by shared scars and unspoken grief. Two men from different wars, both left behind in the peace. The veteran and the musician. The forgotten protector and the forgotten poet. And though Elijah didn't know it yet, meeting Papa J wasn't just a kindness. It was the beginning of a storm. A quiet act that would soon demand a louder reckoning. It happened quietly, like all the cruelest things often do. One morning, Elijah rose at the usual hour, laced his boots with the same deliberate motion he had done for decades, and stepped out into the biting morning air carrying a warm sandwich and 2 cups of black coffee, one sweeter than the other, just the way Papa J liked it. But when he turned the corner near the pharmacy, the street was empty. The crooked wheelchair was gone. So was the cardboard sign. The familiar scent of stale bread and rusted metal that usually lingered around that corner had vanished, leaving only the sterile scent of wet concrete and yesterday's rain. It was like someone had erased a person, not just moved him, but erased him from the very texture of the street. Elijah stood there longer than he meant to, coffee cooling in his hands, heart sinking slowly, not in panic, but in that heavy, aching way only people who've lost things they never thought they'd care about can understand. It wasn't just that Papa J was gone. It was the absence of presence, the sudden silence of a song that had never played loud but had always been there. He waited an hour. Maybe the old man had been taken for a hospital check. Maybe the city had swept the streets again, carting off the homeless like refuse they didn't know how to label. Elijah had seen it before. He'd seen everything. But this time it was personal. By noon, he was walking from block to block, the crumpled sandwich still in his coat pocket, asking questions that earned him mostly shrugs. Most people hadn't even known there was a man in a wheelchair on that corner. One barista thought he'd seen some officers talking to him 2 nights ago. No sirens, no fight. Just voices, and then the screech of a van door. Elijah knew that sound. It wasn't police. It was private. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his apartment with the TV on mute, staring at the wall like it owed him answers. He didn't have Papa J's full name. He didn't know where he had come from, where he might have been taken. But what he did know was the look in Papa J's eyes, the calm resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose, and the quiet terror that hides behind people who are used to being hurt. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. By morning, Elijah was at the local precinct asking questions they didn't want to answer. No record of pickup, they said. We don't keep tabs on every vagrant, they added with a shrug that burned more than any insult. The desk sergeant offered a fake smile and a number to a city shelter that hadn't seen Papa J in over a year. Sorry, sir. Maybe he moved on, the officer said, like the man they were talking about was a piece of luggage. But Elijah knew better. Men like Papa J didn't just move on. Not without a reason. Not without help. And certainly not without leaving a trace. As he walked out of the station, something inside Elijah that had lain still for years began to stir. A familiar burn in the chest. Not anger, purpose. A cold, methodical focus that had served him once in jungles and war zones. His fingers clenched instinctively. His breath slowed. He was no longer just an old man on a quiet street. He was back in the field. And someone somewhere had just made a mistake. They had taken a man the world thought no one cared about. But Elijah Ward cared. And he would find him, whatever it took. 3 days after Papa J disappeared, just as Elijah was beginning to consider less legal methods of gathering information, the letter arrived, hand-delivered, no return address, sealed in a black envelope so thick it felt like velvet. The doorman at his building, a kid named Marcus who always smiled too wide, said it had been dropped off by some guy in a navy suit who spoke without blinking. Elijah turned it over slowly in his hands. There was no stamp, no indication of sender. Just his name, Elijah Ward, written in silver ink across the front in the kind of cursive that hadn't been used since people still took pride in handwriting. He opened it with the tip of a pocketknife. Inside was a single card, heavy, embossed, and smelling faintly of tobacco and money. In the center, in clean serif font, were just a few words. Mr. Ward, your presence is requested. Suite 908. Corinthian Hotel. 8 p.m. Formal attire preferred. No signature. No explanation. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. Elijah stared at it for a long while, something sharp stirring under his ribs. The Corinthian wasn't just any hotel, it was the hotel. The kind of place where oil executives and foreign dignitaries shook hands over $1,000 wine, where the elevator floors were marble and the silence in the hallways was bought by the hour. He hadn't stepped foot in a place like that since a classified mission 2 lifetimes ago. But now, someone had dragged his name into that world, and done so with precision. He didn't own a suit. Not anymore. The best he could do was a press shirt, a worn trench coat, and the kind of posture that made people too uncomfortable to question him. At exactly 7:59, he stepped through the Corinthian's gold-plated revolving doors and into a world of chandeliers and whispers. No one stopped him. No one asked for ID. As he crossed the marble lobby, a young woman in a burgundy uniform approached with practiced warmth and said, "Right this way, Mr. Ward." She led him to the elevator, without waiting for a nod. He said nothing, but his eyes scanned everything, the placement of cameras, the weight of her steps, the way her hand trembled slightly as she pressed the button for the 9th floor. Fear? Respect? Maybe both. The elevator ride was silent. Too silent. The kind that hums with anticipation, with secrets coiled like snakes in the walls. When the doors opened, the hallway was empty. Plush carpet, soft lighting, the distant sound of classical piano. He walked to Suite 908, heart steady, eyes sharp. The door opened before he could knock. And there, standing in the threshold, was a man he didn't recognize but instantly understood. Older, in a tailored suit that cost more than Elijah had made in a year. Hair silver, posture military. No smile, just a nod of acknowledgement. "Mr. Ward," the man said, stepping aside. "He's been expecting you." Inside, the suite was silent and gold-toned, like a room frozen in another era. The lights were dimmed. The air carried the scent of leather-bound books and aged scotch. And then Elijah saw him. Sitting in a wingback chair, legs covered by a dark woolen blanket, a half-empty glass of bourbon in one hand, was Papa J. But not the Papa J he remembered. This man wore a suit. A real one. Silk tie. Pocket square. He looked 10 years younger, or maybe just 10 years seen. His wheelchair was sleek, customized, polished. There was no sign of hunger in his eyes, no weariness in his hands. He looked up and smiled like they'd just left a jazz club. "Evenin', soldier," he said, voice calm, amused. "Bet you got some questions." Elijah stood motionless for a beat, processing everything. Luxury wallpaper, hidden security, Papa J alive and somehow transformed. This wasn't a rescue. It was a reveal. "You disappeared," Elijah said, his voice low, firm. "I looked for you." Papa J nodded, sipping his drink slowly. "I know. That's why you're here." And just like that, The world Elijah thought he understood, the one where pain was simple and injustice had a face, began to unravel into something far more complex. He hadn't found Papa J. Papa J had brought him here. And it was only the beginning. Elijah didn't sit right away. He remained standing just inside the threshold of that golden-lit suite, a quiet storm behind his eyes. Papa J looked up at him from his chair, the amber light catching in the deep creases of his face, and for a long moment neither man spoke. The air between them was taut, fragile, as if the truth waited just outside the window, pressing its fingers against the glass. Finally, Papa J gestured to the leather armchair opposite him. "Relax, son," he said. "Ain't no traps here. Not for you." Elijah sat slowly, but his back never touched the cushion. "You owe me more than that," he said. "You vanish from the street, reappear in silk, call me like this is a job interview. I saw you eating crumbs behind the bank. Don't tell me this was all some kind of test." Papa J let out a low, almost regretful chuckle. "No test, Elijah. A mirror." He reached into a drawer beside him and pulled out a small, worn photograph, creased and yellowed, but Elijah recognized it immediately. It was a combat photo. Afghanistan, 2009. A younger version of Papa J, back when he was still Captain Jerome Maddox, standing beside 3 soldiers. One of them was Elijah. Elijah's breath caught, his mind racing. He hadn't seen that photo in years. It wasn't supposed to exist anymore. "You were my commanding officer," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "You died in that ambush." "That's what they told us." Papa J nodded slowly, eyes distant. "That's what they needed you to believe."
"I didn't die."
"I was extracted, blacklist protocol. Operation Mothlight." Elijah blinked. "That op was sealed. And I was buried with it." Classified into silence. Papa J's tone was gentle, but hard-edged. "But I didn't stay buried. I chose exile. Chose to disappear into the bones of this country, to see it without rank, without salute. I wanted to know what we really fought for." He leaned forward, the silk of his suit folding like armor. "You think I ended up on that street by accident? I was watching the people no one else sees. Watching who still steps up when there's no glory left. And then you showed up." Elijah clenched his jaw. "You let people think you were broken. Hopeless." "I was broken," Papa J said, his voice rising just a note. "But not hopeless. I needed to see if anyone still remembered what honor looked like when it didn't wear a uniform. And you did. You sat next to a crippled man for 37 nights and never once asked him for a thing." The room pulsed with silence. Then Papa J reached into his coat and tossed something onto the table between them. It landed with a soft clink, a dog tag, faded and scorched. Elijah picked it up and turned it over. His name. His ID. But below that, etched by hand, was a string of numbers and a symbol he hadn't seen since the Rangers, coordinates and a call sign. Echo Black 7. Elijah's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" "It's the door," Papa J said, his voice now low and deliberate. "To a network you don't know exists. Veterans like us, burned, disavowed, discarded, built something beneath the noise. A chain of honor that answers when justice fails." He stood, slowly, painfully, but with unmistakable dignity. "We don't wear badges. We don't answer to politicians. We protect what's been forgotten." Quietly. Precisely. Elijah shook his head in disbelief. "Why me?" "Because you still believe," Papa J said, looking him dead in the eyes. "And because you didn't walk away when it was inconvenient. You stayed. Even when no one was watching." Elijah sat back finally, his mind spinning, heart thundering. The past week now unraveled before him like a trail of deliberate threads, each moment, each silence, a test not of strength, but of soul. He hadn't just stumbled into a mystery. He'd been chosen.
Tracked. Watched.
And now he was being invited into something bigger. Something invisible, but immense. "Do I have a choice?" he asked quietly. Papa J nodded. "Always. That's what makes it real." The room fell into a stillness that wasn't empty. It was charged, sacred, like the air before a storm. Elijah looked once more at the dog tag in his hand, the weight of it unfamiliar, yet somehow exactly right. Whatever he'd been before this moment no longer mattered. He wasn't just a man who helped a stranger on a curb. He was the inheritor of a legacy no one spoke of, but everyone needed. He watched her from behind the tinted glass, heart heavy, but eyes unblinking. Esther moved with a tired grace, setting a tray gently before a hunched old man in the corner, her hands trembling slightly from fatigue. For weeks, she had done this without fail, feeding him, talking to him like he mattered, asking nothing in return. She didn't know who he was. She only saw a man who looked forgotten by the world. And that was precisely why he had chosen her. In another life, not long ago, he sat in rooms gilded with gold, in meetings that shaped cities, at tables where billions were moved with the nod of a head. His face was once on the cover of business magazines. But when the accident took his legs and the world turned its eyes away, he decided to disappear, not out of bitterness, but to find something more enduring than wealth: kindness without witness, compassion without reward. Esther reminded him of his mother, a quiet woman who raised 3 children on her own, who gave even when there was barely enough to survive. She had always said, if you want to know a person's soul, see how they treat someone who can offer them nothing. And so, he became that someone. A test, not out of pride, but hope. Hope that in this hardened world, there still existed people like Esther. Every morning, he fought the urge to speak, to reveal. But he needed to be sure. Too many had only helped when cameras were near. Too many wore kindness like a costume. But Esther, she brought food even when it rained, sat beside him even when others stared. She didn't just give a meal, she gave dignity. That could not be bought. He remembered the day she gave him her last slice of bread and smiled, as if he was doing her a favor by taking it. That moment broke something in him, not out of pity, but reverence. He had all the money in the world, but Esther had something he couldn't measure. And so, he waited a little longer, watched a little more until he knew this wasn't just kindness. This was character. And that was the moment the decision was made. Not to repay her because some things are beyond repayment, but to honor her, to remind her, and the world, that goodness still echoes. That the smallest acts, done in silence, might awaken the greatest miracles. The morning she arrived at the Grand Hotel, Esther still wore her faded cardigan and sensible shoes. She clutched her small purse as if it might disappear, unaware of the eyes following her from velvet balconies and polished floors. The man who had once eaten alone in silence now waited at the heart of the opulence, not as a beggar, but as the owner, a billionaire cloaked in humility. When the doors opened and she stepped inside, something in her eyes shifted. It wasn't greed or shock. It was confusion, followed by quiet, hesitant hope. He stood from his chair, slowly, with effort, the prosthetics still foreign to his body, and for the first time, Esther saw him not as the man she had fed, but as someone who had chosen her, watched her, trusted her spirit without her knowing. Her breath caught. He walked toward her not with the pomp of the wealthy, but with the reverence of a soul who had found light in darkness. "I brought you here," he began, voice thick with emotion, "because you reminded me of what matters." Then he handed her the deed. Not a check. Not a single lump sum to make her cry and thank him and disappear into the fog of forgotten generosity. But a deed. To a cafe. A space of her own. A quiet place where she could serve, not because she had to, but because she chose to. With it came staff, a bank account, even a home above the shop. He had remembered every story she had told him between spoonfuls, her dream of baking again, of opening a small place where no one felt invisible. She wept not from surprise, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had been listening, that all her unnoticed sacrifices, all her anonymous acts of care, had meant something, and that, for once, life was giving back not in crumbs, but in fullness. As the staff gathered, as journalists and curious guests leaned in to understand this strange scene of gratitude and grace, he turned to them and said simply, "She gave when she had nothing. She stayed kind when no one was watching. In a world that often rewards performance, I chose to reward character. That was the message. Not just a tale of wealth or charity, but a mirror held up to the world. A call to return to the quiet virtues. A reminder that compassion offered without audience is the rarest currency. And that one woman, one forgotten server with tired hands and a generous heart, had rewritten what it meant to be rich. Not through dollars, but through dignity.